Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on the National Affordable Housing Agenda. My name is Margaret Graham. I'm the Communications Manager at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, and I'm delighted to introduce Garth Rieman today. He is Director of Housing Advocacy and Strategic Initiatives at NCSHA. That's our national organization of other state housing agencies like us. It's the National Council of State Housing Agencies. And Garth leads a whole team at NCSHA of advocacy folks and really directs all of the advocacy efforts there, helping to formulate and execute policy on all kinds of different federal affordable housing issues, such as the housing credit, bonds, housing finance reform on the homeownership side, appropriations, and all sorts of other things. Before that, he held positions with the U.S. Senate Housing Subcommittee, the National Association of Realtors, HUD, the Office of Management and Budget. So Garth has just a lot of experience in DC on the Hill and working on policy. And I'm really excited. We know how wonderful NCSHA is at supporting those of us who are trying to make change at a federal level. And so I'm very delighted to introduce to you Garth Rieman. Garth.
Great, Margaret, thank you very much. I'm excited and delighted to be with you too. And let me just thank the Housing Washington team and Margaret, you and all the folks at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission for all your help and support and for inviting me to participate in this conference. I know how important it is for folks in Washington and what a major event it is, and it's glad to be part of it. And I'm glad that there are folks really from all over now that I understand that are able to participate in it. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I hope you will interact with us by putting questions or comments in the chat. I think that would be great. And it's nice to be able to talk about what's going on in Washington. Sometimes what's going on in Washington isn't all that easy to explain or easy to watch or easy to understand, but I'll try to tell you what I can about what's going on at the national level, the National Affordable Housing Agenda. So I know this may be a little bit of overlap with some of what you may have heard, particularly the sessions yesterday with Emily Kotick and Diane Yentel, and then Sarah Sadian, and I know others too, but I will try to amplify where I can and not spend too much time going over things that may have been covered, but I know not all of you have been able to see every session, so we'll just do what we can. And as an overview, I want to start with what I think is one of the most important pieces of legislation under consideration right now and really setting the agenda in some ways for affordable housing. And that's the budget reconciliation bill Congress is working on, which really offers a historic opportunity to make affordable housing investments that are really unprecedented and to create new programs. And so it deserves some attention, and we'll give it that. There are disagreements over that bill with regard to the total spending level, income targeting for a variety of programs, although not, I think, very much in the affordable housing area, and other policy areas that are obviously obstacles to enactment and quick processing of the legislation. So we'll talk a tiny bit about that. Pretty sure at this point that any final bill will include lower affordable housing spending levels than the House committee passed bill, or which many of you may have heard about. The various committee versions of the budget reconciliation packages have been put into what I will be referring to as the Buildback Better Act, kind of the combined reconciliation bill. We'll want to talk about some other things. Congress is also working on FY 2022 appropriations and other affordable housing legislation. And I'll also want to talk about some regulatory issues. There are some new programs on center stage, as I say, that have been funded over the last few years. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program, the Homeowner Assistance Fund, the Home American Rescue Plan, which is an awkward title, but it has developed into the way people refer to the new funds provided through the home program for special purposes. So I'll talk about that later. The coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are another important source of affordable housing. So some important new programs there. Meanwhile, certainly since the new administration has taken office, the regulatory agencies and the federal agencies are taking some steps, sometimes dramatic, often consequential for affordable housing. And yet we know that one of the reasons for all this action is that there are serious affordable housing challenges. Many of them are going to persist almost regardless of what happens, although clearly all these steps are hopefully going to make a dent in that. But I want to talk a little bit about what may stay on the agenda almost regardless of what happens. So let's just dive into the budget reconciliation bill to get started. The House and Senate both passed the same budget resolution after a few different tries and development of the bill, which approved $3.5 trillion in spending. Lots of people are focusing on that number because it's the new amount of tax expenditures and additional spending that that resolution authorized, although exactly what the final total spending would be after you take into account tax hikes and other changes has been very difficult to determine and really a changing target. But the main point is that as a result, or to follow up on that resolution, the House committees, virtually all of the committees in the House, have reported various tax and spending provisions, many of them having to do with affordable housing, which I'll go into in a minute. As I said, some senators and some House members, others have objected to the total spending level that it looked like the Buildback Better Act as it was coming through the House would lead to, and objected to some other provisions. And they are key votes because this legislation cannot go forward without their votes. And so the Democrats really have to spend some time negotiating to come up with a final set of spending and tax provisions that everybody agrees to. The latest discussions seem to point out that the total funding level from that 3.5 trillion will probably come down to somewhere between 1.9 and 2.3 trillion. So could be probably about a third less, which really will mean that several of the funding levels that went into what the committees were doing are not sustainable. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about whether they should just do a pro rata cut to all of those different provisions to get to the lower funding level. But there's quite a bit of concern and energy going into saying, no, there are a few distinct priorities and provisions that we really need to focus on. Child care tax credit is one of those, for example, and some of the climate related legislation. And so as a result of that, there is a significant chance that some priorities, a significant amount, if not potentially all of the affordable housing provisions, could be dropped from the bill if we don't do everything we can to show how important it is and try to insist that some of those spending and some of those provisions remain included in the bill. So what are we talking about? I think many of you have probably heard a little bit about this already, but some of the spending levels that were passed by the House Financial Services Committee and combined into the current version of the Buildback Better Act are listed on this slide. Just to highlight a couple of priorities. Obviously, the biggest funding is for rental assistance in public housing. It's very important to many people that we do what we can to increase the affordable housing supply. So significant new amounts for the Housing Trust Fund, Home Investment Partnerships Program are included. We want to do what we can to try to improve home ownership and address the racial home ownership and wealth gap. And so there's $10 billion for a new down payment assistance program. and $10 billion for a new housing investment fund that would try to leverage community development, financial institutions, and other entities to try to do kind of comprehensive community development and housing strategies. And then there are additional funds for climate resilience, rehab to help with climate change, provisions on lead paint and other ways to try to make housing more healthy, additional funds for rural housing programs and others. So a lot of really important and necessary funding for a variety of both existing and new programs. I want to delve a little bit deeper on the tax side, because if I was hearing some of what was discussed yesterday and just seeing some of what's been published about this, I think there's a little bit more discussion about the spending provisions, but there's some really important tax provisions that I wanted to focus in on. One is that there are provisions that would expand and improve the low-income housing tax credit, again, focusing on supply and rehab and making more affordable housing is a very important element of the strategy. The bill would provide for a 60% increase in the housing credit with a 4-year phase-in of 15% per year. There's another provision that would change what people refer to as the bond financing test, that would make properties with as little as 25% of the costs paid by bond proceeds eligible for the 4% credit. Right now, those properties to be eligible for the 4% credit have to have 50% or more of the costs paid for by tax-exempt bonds. And so this provision would really release quite a bit of tax-exempt bond authority by requiring, in essence, half as much for an individual housing credit development to get those 4% credits, and very likely make it feasible, although obviously each property will be a little bit different. There are basis boosts, which allow the Housing Credit Allocating Agency to provide additional credits on top of the normal amounts that a property would be eligible for, to provide more equity and improve economic feasibility. 50% basis boost for extremely low income units included in the housing credit developments. 30% basis boost for properties in rural and Native American areas. I know some of these provisions have been very important to key Washington legislators that I'll talk a little bit more about later. It would help with preservation and to deal with some serious issues that have been rising up around the country, and to try to prevent losing housing credit units. It would repeal the qualified contract option for new properties and change the formula for pricing that option for existing properties. And it would replace the nonprofit right of first refusal with the purchase option. Again, Washington has been, in a sense, the center of the storm and some of the issues around the right of first refusal, and I think to a lesser extent, but also with qualified contracts, and very important to try to take the opportunity we have to assist in preservation before we lose these at-risk units. Sorry, I went the wrong way with that, excuse me. Other provisions, mostly on the tax side, the bill would create a new neighborhood homes tax credit to support the construction and rehabilitation of for sale housing in distressed areas. Very important provision, again, to increase supply and to focus on the for sale inventory. Makes the new markets tax credit permanent, which many folks interested in housing and community development have been eager to do for a while. And this is not a tax provision. It would establish the Down Payment Toward Equity Act. That's the $10 billion in the House bill. And I just included this additional bill, the Low Income First Time Home Buyers, or LIFT Act. It's not included in the House bill yet, but it's very much part of the conversation about what to do in terms of providing down payment assistance and supporting home ownership and trying to address racial equity and similar issues. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is an item that could be included, and the Down Payment Toward Equity Act funding is already included. I'm going to shift now to appropriations, but before I do, Margaret, I just wanted to check and see if there were any comments or chat questions coming up that are specific to reconciliation before I move into kind of another area.
No, not right now. People are just,
Okay.
Yep. But
Okay.
Everyone, please do note that if you would like to join the chat, there's a button on the right side of your screen, and just click that and you'll be able to share with us. Thank you.
That's right. So hopefully I'm answering what questions you might have in mind, or I don't know if I'm just numbing you into silence, but let's start talking about appropriations. Normally, the appropriations for the next fiscal year need to be passed by September 30th because the beginning of the next fiscal year is October 1st. We did not have bills passed for appropriations for fiscal year 22, which we have just gone into as of October 1st. So Congress passed a continuing resolution. They made it dramatic, as they often do, by going right up until the last minute, almost literally, with I think the president signing the bill. I think it was somewhere between 9 and 10 at night, but that's not important. But it was right up to the last minute, extending HUD and other programs through December 3rd. So that now is the new deadline for when they need to act. And this is the last item. I'm going a little out of order. That could be another CR in case they need a little bit more time. It could be a standalone HUD bill with various appropriations bills going on individual bases, or it could be an omnibus bill. The way the House just recently passed its version of the FY22 appropriations bill, it combined 7 different bills normally that would be separate into one bill and pass that all together. So they might do that closer to the end of the year, or hopefully even by December 3rd. Although I have to say, I think that's a little bit less likely, and they'll probably need a little bit more time depending on how things go with other issues. So I mentioned the House bill. The House bill did include moderate but significant increases in several HUD programs, including home, quite a bit of money for additional housing vouchers in the rental assistance account, and other HUD programs. I'm not going to go through them all because it's a little bit less relevant right now. We need to see what the Senate does. The Senate is still working on its HUD appropriations bill, and then those bills need to be combined. That would be the normal way that this would go through. They need to be conferenced, and a final version needs to come up. So that is all still in the process. It still makes a lot of sense to talk to the appropriators about the need for adequate HUD funding levels and rural housing in the Department of Agriculture bill. I will say that the increases in those programs really are not anywhere close to the new amounts provided in the reconciliation bill. And one of the reasons for that is because there really needs to be more bipartisan agreement on the appropriations bills, whereas under the reconciliation bill, as long as they get every Democrat with them, they can move the bill forward just with Democratic support. So slightly lower amounts in the appropriations bill, but we're still hoping that there will be significant increases there. Okay, I'm going to come back to this question that I think may have come up in the chat about Buildback Better, but I may address that as I go into some other issues, because what I want to do now is talk about some of the key pieces of legislation as separate bills, even though many of them, or the elements of them, are being included in the reconciliation bill. So I hope that's not too confusing, and I'll try to explain it. But on this slide, for example, we have the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which has a number of provisions to expand and improve the housing credit. Some of them I just listed because they have been included in the budget reconciliation bill. There are some changes in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that have not been included in the reconciliation bill. And so that the remaining provisions may be considered on a standalone basis or set aside to wait for future major legislation or something else. But I just want to pause here, particularly talking to an audience that is mostly folks from Washington, to thank you for the efforts and discussions you've been having with Senator Cantwell and Representative Del Bene particularly, because they have just demonstrated themselves to be incredible champions for this legislation, and to just congratulate you on having legislators that are in the lead on affordable housing legislation like this. They are the respective chief sponsors, along with a couple of other lead sponsors in the Senate and the House for this legislation. And there's no question that much of what is included in it is because of their leadership and their decisions and their commitment to these issues. I just wanted to add and note again that these provisions having to do with securing a right of first refusal and preventing qualified contract process losses are also bills that are moving through the Senate. They haven't been included exactly as part of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act or on a separate basis, but they're also very important for trying to make sure we preserve these at-risk units. Another key piece of legislation that I mentioned is in the reconciliation bill, is also a standalone bill, the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, to create this tax credit to cover either construction or rehab and acquisition and rehab costs for sale housing, primarily in distressed areas. This program is modeled substantially on the low-income housing tax credit. It would be state administered with allocations coming from the federal government to each state based essentially on a per capita basis with small state minimums. And then those amounts would be allocated by the states to developers or to nonprofits that might be working almost like a general contractor for a number of developers and a number of projects. There would be flexibility in how to do that, but those allocations would be based on allocation plans to try to target those resources much the way qualified allocations plans do for the housing credit. The program is designed to be eligible for homes in areas with high poverty rates, low median family incomes, and low home values. So there are some concerns about whether this program is a little bit too highly targeted. So there are some provisions that give the states some flexibility and add disaster areas as eligible areas. Those aren't in, the disaster areas isn't included in this underlying bill, but that's the way the provisions in the reconciliation bill are a little bit different. This is true of the underlying legislation and the reconciliation bill for construction projects. Eligible purchasers must have incomes at or below 140% of the area or state median income. The rehab or an acquisition rehab is a little bit more tightly targeted for incomes at or below the area or state median income. Other legislation that is also on a freestanding basis, but also included in the Buildback Better Act, is the Down Payment Toward Equity Act. I think I just want to say that it would provide through states and nonprofits up to $25,000 each for lower income, first generation home buyers. And this idea of first generation is really a interesting kind of policy breakthrough, if you will. More discussion about how that's necessary to get at racial equity concerns and homeowners, or not homeowners, but potential homeowners, families that have not had the historical buildup of wealth through family members or others that can pass that on to their children in any way, or just first-time home buyers, people that haven't owned homes and been able to generate equity. And so it does seem like there are ways that this might provide more equitable opportunities for people to get into home ownership. So I said before, the Low Income First Time Home Buyers Act, the LIFT Act, has not been included in the reconciliation bill, although part of the negotiations are going on, lead me to believe that if down payment assistance is included in the final version, it will probably be a combination of funding for these two different strategies. the LIFT strategy is designed to make a mortgage more affordable by looking at what a traditional 30-year mortgage would cost a homeowner, and then figure out how to maintain that payment level, but make it a 20-year mortgage. So the homeowner amortizes the principal more quickly, builds more equity, and then the differential between those two payments is paid for by a financing mechanism through HUD and Treasury. So some people are concerned that this doesn't feel as much like a first-time home buyer provision. It's more of an equity building, but the sponsors of this legislation, I think, definitely want to make sure it is targeted towards the same group of first-time, first-generation home buyers with a slightly higher income eligibility, up to 120% of area median income. So we'll see how these negotiations go and the kind of mix and matching of these strategies, but they're pretty exciting new bills that we think can really help increase home ownership in general, but also just help address some of these gaps. So maybe this is a good time to talk a tiny bit about the question that was asked, because here's a bunch of legislation that both is on a standalone basis, but has also been discussed in the budget reconciliation bill, kind of how and where can it be included? And since reconciliation is so much the major issue right now, where does it look like they're focusing and most likely to put funds and programs into the Buildback Better Act? As I said, right now, it looks a little bit like it may be tough for virtually everything to stay in. But in the housing area, we know that there's a great deal of advocacy for the general strategy of addressing rental costs with vouchers. We know that there's great concern over providing additional money for public housing. Now, part of the clue for that is that those were the two highest funding amounts in the House committee passed bills. There are a number of us that are trying very hard to talk about how important the Housing Trust Fund is and how important home is, particularly to try to increase supply. So on the spending side, I think there's some focus on those programs, although there's also a great deal of focus on the strategy of addressing climate change. And so the programs and the funding that lend themselves to maybe preferences or priorities, maybe even set-asides as it moves through the process for climate change and resilience, I think is going to be an important part of it. On the tax side, I think there's a lot of support, a lot of bipartisan support, a lot of support from moderates and progressives who are the major negotiating players right now, the progressive Democrats and the moderate Democrats, and there's a lot of overlap between them and all that, but that's, for lack of a better way of kind of explaining it, is where most of the discussion is taking place. A lot of support in both groups in the housing credit, particularly with some of the provisions that help with preservation and provide a basis boost for extremely low income units. So we're very hopeful that we'll get at least some expansion of the housing credit and some of those good provisions to make it even more effective. Nothing's guaranteed, but I think that there's a priority there. There's certainly people that are pushing the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I want to help answer the question by saying, yes, some are more likely than others. I know people are concerned about for sale housing, but I think that that has a little bit less of a history and may not be quite as high on the list as the housing credit and others. But I don't want to jinx anybody or talk down any of the programs or funding, because certainly all of them are important. And Margaret, maybe we can stay on this for a minute if you've got a couple of other questions, because I think I can move through the other slides pretty quickly. So we've got some time.
Okay, great. Yeah, this one is very much related to what you were just mentioning. What should we focus on in terms of advocacy? Given the bipartisan nature of support for the tax credit program, what items should we focus on?
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of process priorities and a couple of substantive priorities. I mean, process, as I said, now it is really down to this discussion between the progressives and the moderates. So focus on Democrats. It also is being primarily taking place at a leadership level. So this is leadership of the Senate and the House. So if you can find ways to get to leaders of those of the Democratic Party in both chambers, either through your members talking directly to them or other leaders. There's the whole hierarchy of leaders, whips and other people involved in that. But also very important because of the discussion of the moderates and the progressives, the leaders of the Progressive Caucus. So Pramila Jayapal is just key in this discussion because of that, and then also leaders of the Problem Solvers Caucus. And so I'm just trying to focus on those leaders and those key members. And then really depending on who you're talking to, frankly, I think the progressives need to be convinced that that programs that they may be worried are not as targeted as they would like the low-income housing credit and home, really deserve support because they're so important. Maybe they're a little bit less focused on the home ownership. And then conversely on the talking to folks on the moderates, kind of helping them to understand how important these provisions are and to really see the value in the public housing and the vouchers and others. I think that for the most part, most of these people do. They've been supportive of these priorities, but it is just such a zero-sum game now where they have to, as I said, take what was at least a $3.5 billion, I don't know what the, package and stick it into a trillion, and stick it in a $2 trillion box. And so things are going to have to be shaved down or cut out. So that, I think that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention one thing I heard definitely yesterday from Emily Kadick was that even if your members are supportive of housing and all over housing, usually that they really need to hear from us. So in Washington State, we're lucky to have a whole lot of members that care about this, but it sounds like we can't just assume that they are making this their first priority.
Yeah, that is such a good point because even people that are leaders that have sponsored affordable housing legislation also have sponsored other legislation and are incredibly committed to some of the big ticket items like the child care tax credit and Medicare and other provisions. So it is really important, even for people that you think are the strongest affordable housing champions, to get back to them and say, look, we really need you to go to the extraordinary lengths on this to make it your top priority or one of top 2 priorities, because there's a chance that that's as far down the list as they'll really be able to have an influence on this bill. So thanks for drawing that out. I would totally agree and kind of try to add to it that way.
One more thing on a related note from Lisa Vatsky in the chat. She was mentioning that you could do a little bit of a what if, like what if housing is not included in reconciliation, especially the sunset of the 9% increase. That could be an important part of messaging to those folks. But the other thing is if there's any potential for year-end tax extenders.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. And again, particularly talking to some of the progressives where not for any super specific reason, but they just seem to be talking a little bit less about the housing credit. Affordable housing supply and the way the housing credit and other programs work to provide affordability is key to provide a much broader platform to address all kinds of progressive causes, improved education, welfare, health, equity, all of these. So, affordable housing supply and the housing credit really in particular is so key to that. So I definitely would agree with all of that. That what if scenario is a good one. And I'm sorry, I think there was another point that was actually the main part of the question. What was that?
It was about the possibility of tax extenders.
Yes, thank you. I personally think that it's very likely that this debate will continue going until late in the year. On timing right now, they're shooting for October 31st, but there are going to be very difficult negotiations, and there's no real logic to why October 31st is a vital date other than they've picked it, which I point out to say that it would be kind of easy for them to say, well, maybe we can't do it till November. Maybe we can't do it till Thanksgiving. I mean, they're anxious to pass these bills as soon as possible. And the longer it takes, I think the more they feel like it is not providing some of the political advantages and benefits they're hoping to create, nor is it just getting these funds out and useful, which they want to do as quickly as possible. But it is very possible that a lot of this, it could even be combined with appropriations, it could be combined with other tax legislation, it could become a very big bill. But the reconciliation bill itself probably means that it's less likely that there will be a big end of the year tax and spending bill. It's still possible, probably a couple of extenders, a little bit thrown into what might be an appropriations omnibus, but I think that there will be a lot of pressure from people saying, look, we did so much of what we hope to do in the reconciliation bill, we really don't have room to do much more. Now, if a lot of things get cut and they really need to do more, maybe they will. So, it's frustrating, saying on the one hand and on the other in these situations, but that's just, I think, some of the questions and some of the reasons that it might play out one way or another by the end of the year. So let me talk about a couple of other things and try to leave time at the end, if that's okay. A couple of other, this is more issues rather than bills, although there are specific bills that contain all of these priorities, but some of the major issues under discussion in housing legislation this year are eviction prevention, either eviction diversion programs or eviction avoidance, and a variety of different provisions having to do with notice and disclosure or funding and housing stability and search services, things like that. So eviction has just become, I think, a much more important issue as we've gone through the threat of evictions and just more awareness about the impact and prevalence of evictions over the last couple of years. Bills that are trying to get at this idea of supply through providing incentives or requirements to promote more inclusionary zoning and elimination of regulatory barriers for the development of affordable housing. Bills to improve the voucher program and try to expand it, even a bill that would make vouchers an entitlement for all eligible families. So quite a bit of discussion on that, some of which will not be addressed in the reconciliation bill. So some of these provisions will clearly, some of these issues will clearly be major items for discussion. A major bill going through to authorize and reform some of the disaster response and recovery programs. Legislation potentially to create a renter's tax credit. And so these are a number of items that almost whatever happens with reconciliation, I would expect quite a bit of discussion to continue later this year and next year as they continue to work on these areas. So as I said, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the key new programs that are being administered. I'm sure that they're getting launched in Washington and you're learning more about these. I'll just go over some of kind of the national picture issues pretty quickly. The program provided funds to states, local governments, and tribal entities to help COVID impacted renters. And virtually all of these programs are up and running. Many of them have spent all or almost all of their funds. The number of families assisted is steadily rising. The spending rates in terms of the percentage of how much money each grantee receives is steadily increasing also. There's been a lot of discussion about that, I know, but I think that many people feel we're really on a pretty good trajectory right now. But Treasury and others are starting to try to think especially about, do some areas have too much money compared to need, and do some areas have not enough money compared to need? So they have launched a process to try to recapture and reallocate funds. That's just been kind of breaking and coming together over the last couple of weeks. Treasury is trying to make sure that they reallocate within state as much as possible, and don't take funds certainly that have been obligated, and also don't take funds that the grantees are telling Treasury that the grantees are confident they will be able to obligate in the near future. But Treasury is trying to set up a system where it'll look at what they think is the amount of funds or the percentage of funds that responsible grantees would have spent by now, and then look at the difference between what they have and what they've spent as an amount that might need to be recaptured and reallocated. Treasury is going to do this slowly over a phased in approach. So I don't think anybody should worry about losing huge amounts or gaining huge amounts except over this phased in approach, but really key development in what's happening with this program right now. One of the other major new programs is the Homeowner Assistance Fund. And while some states, including Washington, I believe, have been implementing pilots and learning a little bit about how to run this program and how to get it going to try to figure out how to assist people avoid foreclosures and pay home ownership related costs that they're in arrears on. We have been working with a variety of servicers, counseling agencies, and others to try to make sure that everybody's ready to launch this program as soon as Treasury releases the additional funds. They're going to do that when states submit their homeowner assistance plans, and then Treasury approves them. Treasury has about 40 state plans, and I think maybe a few more tribal entity plans. I think there are maybe a couple hundred tribal entities that are potentially eligible for this program. And so Treasury, we hope, will begin approving these plans in the next couple of weeks. And then those entities will have additional funds and be able to really launch those programs on a wider scale. Another, I think, important source of money that I think some people are not as aware of is that the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund provided $350 billion for a broad range of activities allocated individually out to the states. And affordable housing is clearly eligible, although some ways that it can be used are only eligible under certain conditions. We know that many states want to use their fiscal recovery funds for housing. Some have already passed either legislative or governor proposed plans that would use money for affordable housing. We are trying to make sure we address a couple of issues that restrict the way those funds can be targeted geographically, that some states feel are too restrictive. And also because normally it's so effective to loan money over a period of time for affordable housing, there's a provision that says funding is only eligible to be used from fiscal recovery funds under essentially short to medium term loans. We're worried about how that may prevent some states from providing helpful assistance to housing credit properties and others. So we're trying to work through some of those issues. But the idea that these fiscal recovery funds can still be used for housing and are a really valuable resource is definitely a major point. And I would encourage you to talk to people in your state to look into how Washington or other states, how your state plans to use the fiscal recovery funds, and to try to encourage people to use as much as possible of them for affordable housing. The other program I mentioned, the Home ARP funds earlier. These are additional home funds, $5 billion to provide special assistance targeted in a variety of different eligible activities to help persons experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, and domestic violence survivors, including few different kind of categories of people that I'm just kind of generalizing that way. HUD published some guidance last month that took longer than I think we really wanted, but it was extensive, and we understand why they needed to take a lot of time. It provides a lot of very needed flexibility to use the money for tenant-based rental assistance or operating assistance, or to purchase and convert properties like hotels or others into affordable housing. So it really seems like it's going to be a valuable resource for permanent supportive housing. And the grantees are getting the guidance from HUD, participating in webinars, getting ready to implement those funds. I know I'm getting toward the end here. Let me just talk about a couple of other things. HUD is, with Treasury, reinstating the Federal Financing Bank initiative for risk-sharing loans, which allows HFAs to access easier, lower-cost financing for affordable rental housing. That reinstatement went into effect as of October 1st, and we're hoping that that will be a valuable source of additional funds for rental housing. There have been a lot of regulatory changes. I'm not going to go into nearly as much depth on these, but clearly the National Affordable Housing Agenda includes a number of items that are basically regulatory items. HUD has already been producing quite a few regulations recently on COVID relief, and they continue to do that, about forbearance, whether monitoring can be done on a remote basis as this COVID health hazard continues to be prominent, supplemental funding for COVID-related expenditures and others. FHA has initiated a couple of changes to the way single-family loans that are insured by FHA can be modified to reduce payments, and how the potential losses of homeowners can be mitigated with partial claims and other assistance. We know HUD is planning on moving forward with disparate impact regulations, requirements on grantees on how to affirmatively further fair housing. We still think on their agenda is looking at down payment assistance provided in conjunction with FHA single-family insured loans. And that's a key reg that may affect just the way down payment can be attached to those loans to promote home ownership. Federal Housing Finance Agency is issuing some key rules. They have been right now, they have some key rules out for comment. New proposed affordable housing goals that will drive the GSE's activities over the next few years. A new requirement for the GSEs to create equitable housing finance plans, and comments are due on those two rules by the end of the month. And I encourage folks to work with us or other national groups that you may be members of, or just your own comments on those rules, because they're really key. FHFA is continuing to monitor the COVID-related forbearance and eviction protection guidance that it has out. It's working with the GSEs to develop new duty to serve requirements that will be coming out shortly. And so key areas with the GSEs. And then just quickly, the CFPB, USDA, control of the currency with its CRA obligations are very important. And this is my last slide. I'm sorry there won't be more time for additional questions, but there may be a little. Just a lot of focus on housing affordability, particularly on the tenant side through vouchers or other mechanisms, increasing affordable housing supply, maintaining a focus on racial equity and inclusion to try to address some of those gaps, addressing homelessness as it just continues to be a vexing and difficult problem, but one that we're really developing strategies that point toward ways to solve and significantly deal with it if we have the resources and adopt those strategies. Preservation, rehab, resilience, especially in areas that are subject to serious disaster risk and climate-related disaster risk. And then more generally, disaster preparation and recovery, how to get assistance quicker and faster to those areas and to rebuild in a resilient way that tries to avoid future problems. So that is my presentation. we may have a minute for a question or two. I think that there might have been one having to do with inclusionary zoning. Margaret, if you want to go to that or whatever we should do.
Right. That one was about inclusionary zoning and barrier reduction. What are some expectations on how well this will improve the availability of low-income housing? Are there projected improvement percentages for Washington and California?
Yeah, no, I don't have any percentages yet. I mean, this really, I think, is the federal policymakers are trying to dovetail with some state and local efforts. I think Congress is still really, and HUD is wrestling with how much to do this with carrots, where there are incentives, you get more grant money if you do this or that, or sticks, where you may lose grant money if you don't do this or that. And a lot of it has to do with just reducing single family zoning rules and allowing more duplexes in areas that might have been large lot, single family zoned, and provisions like that. So that's still really developing, but a number of those issues are on the table in the discussion.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Garth. This is really helpful. And, I'm definitely hearing that there's work for us to do, even in Washington, where we have so many supportive Congress members of housing. It just sounds like everything is so squeezed that the more noise we make, the better. So it's a really good reminder.
Yeah, it is still an incredible opportunity to achieve some really significant funding increases. But yeah, we really do have to do all that work to convince them to do that. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about it. I've had a great time talking to you all, and appreciate your interest in housing, and hope that we can all make a big difference.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to encourage everybody to familiarize yourself with NCSHA and its work. It's, I believe it's ncsha.org.
Yes.
Yeah, they're our national organization, as I said, and they've got lots of great advocacy information and links to other organizations. So definitely check that out. So I will let you all go, but remind you that at 11:10 is the next session. It's a keynote address by Justin Maxon of USDA Rural Development. Then there will be afternoon sessions starting at 12:10. You can choose your session, and our closing keynote starts at 1:10, and that will be former HUD Secretary Julian Castro. So I hope you won't miss that, and we will see you there. Thanks, everyone.